Hi, we are back in the fourth part of our 16-part documentary, which we prepare to shed light on the darkest period of German history and the bitter realities of the Second World War. In this episode, we will analyze the expansionist efforts of Japan, the greatest military power in Asia. Sworn in on the 20th of January in Washington, Roosevelt was the first U.S. president to run for a third term. For unexplained reasons, Roosevelt said in his speech that day, even if tyranny and slavery threatened to overwhelm the future of the world like a flood wave, America and democracy would still not back down. Roosevelt presided over a self-sufficient, war-weary country. As in every country, there were some expansionists in the USA, but they were not in the majority. President Roosevelt therefore pursued a provocative policy towards Japan. In other words, he was tightening the noose around Japan's neck by freezing its foreign exchange resources, blocking the oil and other underground resources that were vital for Japan, and telling them to go their own way. As I said, the noose around the neck of the Japanese was getting tighter and tighter, taking their breath away, and at some point they would reach the end of their patience and explode. On the other hand, strangely enough, the defeated European powers, the defeated Netherlands, France, and Great Britain, had no strategy and no idea what would happen if their house of cards collapsed and they were unable to defend their possessions in the Far East. The Western imperial powers were trying with all their might to hold on to their colonies and use them to defend themselves against the threat from Japan. The Allies supported their enemy, China, to stop Japanese expansion. They supplied raw materials and arms to southern China through Burma, which belonged to British India. Since its coasts were occupied by Japan, China's only connection to the sea was through Burma. The so-called Burma Road. Merchandise from the west was transported from the capital Rangoon to the interior of China. More than 200,000 Chinese workers completed the 1,150 kilometers long mountain road in 1 year. The Japanese tried to cut China's connection with the Western world with their attacks at irregular intervals. However, the Burma Road was constantly repaired after each attack. Japan occupied Indochina in 1941 and thus gained a huge springboard. In a sense, it had a land bridge from Manchuria via Beijing, along the Chinese coast to Vietnam, Burma and the Thai subcontinent. This meant that the defeated powers, Britain and France, had to watch helplessly as their colonial resources fell piecemeal into Japanese hands. The Americans were spectators to this drama. But they were not entirely disinterested. Because there was a beautiful island off the coast of South China. Not really an island, it's the Philippines. It's a huge archipelago. At the beginning of the 20th century, this area was to be the gateway to the Chinese market, for the American West Coast. The US invaded the Philippines after the war against Spain. And colonized it, despite the Philippine Declaration of Independence in 1901. Since then, the archipelago had become not only a trading center, but also an important naval base. Since 1935, Pan American Airlines had been operating flights across the Pacific to Cavite, a peninsula in Manila Bay, with the China Clipper, a 4-engine seaplane. The tourists who traveled to the region in these planes to enjoy colonial-style life to the fullest, did not seem to believe in a Japanese invasion. The Americans had a plan that they knew would not work, and they hoped that the day would never come, when they would have to implement this Orange Plan. The plan envisaged that, if Japan did as predicted and attacked the Philippines, the American Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii, would be dispatched to the area. The American garrison in the Philippines would manfully defend itself. And in about 2 or 3 months the glorious White Fleet would arrive, and rescue the garrison. It was a plan that everyone knew and realized was unrealistic. But it had one small advantage, the Air Force. New weapons, almost unknown in the First World War, had been added, namely bombers. and a bomber squadron of no small size had been established at the airfields around Manila. It was hoped that this bomber fleet would deter the Japanese from attacking the region. About 10,000 American troops were stationed in the Philippines. Although much of the equipment and weaponry was obsolete, the Commander General Douglas MacArthur believed that the gradually increasing supply shipments could turn the archipelago into a fortress. Closer and closer to its powerful German allies, Japan wanted to seize the raw materials of the Western colonies to sustain the war. And it was desperate for support. Foreign Minister Matsuoka saw an agreement with Nazi Germany and Italy as a counterbalance to the power of the United States. He also hoped to bring the Soviet Union into the coalition. But the Japanese were not aware of Hitler's war plans. Japan had a big problem. The homeland consisted of 3 small islands with almost no oil or steel. This meant that Japan lacked the raw materials indispensable for war, namely oil and steel. Even the occupation of Manchuria was not enough to wage this war between the leading country in Asia, Japan, and the Western world. The Japanese Emperor Hirohito and his militaristic government were striving for domination of the so-called Greater East Asian habitat. French Indochina was already occupied with the approval of the pro-Hitler Vichy government in France. Japan was now preparing to take control of the Dutch colonies in Indonesia. In order to feel secure against interference with its totalitarian expansionist policy, Japan sought to secure the neutrality of the great powers. On April 13, Foreign Minister Matsuoka went to Moscow with a delegation, to make a grandiose debut. And Japan signed a non-aggression pact with its dangerous neighbor, the Soviet Union. The real enemies in Asia were in fact Japan and Russia. Stalin, the shrewdest and most skillful politician of his time, now had a tangible strategy. Stalin had already shown the Japanese that they should be wary of him, in a series of border skirmishes in Mongolia and Manchuria in 1939. Above all, Russia and Japan had secured each other's rear fronts with the non-aggression pact. Thus, Stalin could protect his own back against the Japanese army, and the Japanese could turn their backs on their South Pacific adventures. In other words, they were back to back, and actually fighting the same enemy. So we came to the end of the 4th part of the documentary we prepared about World War II. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so as not to miss the other episodes. Until the next episode of our documentary, goodbye.